Okay, so left off here basically saying that as Whitty tells us, we're left with these two clauses in the First Amendment that then are somewhat ill-defined, definitely are more ill-defined for us today as things have changed in this country in terms of state powers, both federal level and more regional state level powers, as well as also the religious scene in this country today. As we've said before in this class, there's been huge changes in terms of a growing religious pluralism in the United States of America, in terms of also somewhat of a privatization of religious activity, as well as the same point, kind of a reemergence of religious groups into the political sphere, especially in the last 30 years. So what we get today around this church and state continued relationship is really kind of two things. And I'm going to link it up here with what I've already wrote, and I'm going to explain this. So basically, when people look at how both religious groups as well as state actors deal with church-state relationships today, we have kind of two schools. One's called the separationist and one's called the accommodationist school. The separationist school are the ones that look at the no establishment clause of the First Amendment. And what this group is saying, and you can especially think of groups like People United for the Separation of Church and State, I think that's the name of the group. You'll catch my drift here in a second. What they do is they look at the Constitution and they argue that there should be no preference, no aid whatsoever for no religious groups. They are specifically concerned to make sure that there's nothing that the Congress does or that any state actor does that supports religious groups in any way whatsoever. An example of how this camp has argued in the past is the 1962, which was the first decision at the Supreme Court level that ruled against the legality of school prayer. And the concern here for these groups is that any time religion is brought into a state process, schooling, parks, laws, funding, their concern is that these instances are always liable to be coercive and to indoctrinate people into supporting certain religious beliefs, okay? So school prayer, as I said in 1962, was the first time this was ruled about. This has become a flashpoint issue for these groups. And over time, the court has ruled that has ruled against moment of silences, has ruled against student-sponsored prayers at graduation or before football games. And in all of these cases, they're ruled around this idea of not establishing, in other words, not doing something as state actors that will encourage particular religions, but also these separationists, as we might call them in terms of their legal thoughts, don't want, many of them don't want any type of religion at all supported, okay? So then we contrast this to those who argue using the other part of the First Amendment, and they look to the Free Exercise Clause, and we call those people accommodationists. These are people oftentimes arguing from a religious viewpoint who are saying, well, look, the Free Exercise Clause mandates that we be allowed to exercise whatever preference we have of our religion. And so they're worried of two things. One, they don't want the state encroaching and squelching their belief, but also they will oftentimes look to see if there's ways that the state can encourage or allow their religious beliefs and their practices to flourish. They read into this clause in the Constitution, they read a preference in the United States for religion. They say, look, in our founding documents, there is a preference saying that we should be able to practice our religion. So they are going to look in many ways to push the U.S. and to push any state actor away from a neutral stance on a religion to actually potentially supporting religion. So classic case for accommodationists was this 1879 case, which was about polygamy in the Mormon Church. Accommodationists arguing at that point, saying, look, this is our religious belief, we should be able to practice this. The Supreme Court rules at that time making a distinguishment between belief and behavior, saying you can believe whatever you want, but it's up to the state to be able to regulate some behaviors. In this case, regulate polygamy and rule it illegal and unconstitutional. And ever since this case, there's been a long series of cases which are about this kind of distinction between belief and behavior. At what point can the state come in and say, look, you can believe whatever you want, but we're not going to let you to behave however you want? Most recently, some of the hot topics on this came out of a 1990 case, which was called Oregon Employment Division against Smith. Smith was a Native American, a peyote user, who had been fired by his Oregon state job for using peyote. Smith argued, saying, look, this is my religious belief, this is my religious practice, and therefore you can't rule against me on this. The Supreme Court did rule against Smith on this, and since 1890, the last 19 years, we've had a whole flurry of cases come all the way up to the Supreme Court that have been arguing to try and create space to say, look, the United States government may actually not be accommodating free exercise enough. So there's been laws passed by state courthouses, by the federal Congress, to try and give more room for religious groups to be able to freely exercise their religious ideas. The whole long and short of this is that there's clearly a built-in tension in the rule of the game between different approaches to religion, to church and state relationships. There are different camps, the separationist camp and the accommodation camp, that look to these various rules of the game. And then when you throw all this into the fact that, as I said before, we have a fractured state with different levels of state authorities and different religious groups trying to access those levels, we get what in many ways looks like a bit of a mess. But instead, it's better to pull back and say what we really get is a continually renegotiating and re-navigating of the boundary between church and state. And this boundary is really about a struggle over a couple of things. Symbols, so what we in the United States see as the core symbols, whether they're church symbols or state symbols, what are the core symbolic meanings to who we are as a people. But these are also struggles over power, over resources, and over access, both power and resources that from church groups trying to access power and resources in state groups, but also power and resources of the state trying to control or access the power and resources of state groups. So the long story short is, because both of these institutions, state and church, are highly legitimate and are built into the actual founding of the United States, we should expect a continual process of boundary defining to continue to occur. In other words, there will be no final say, if you will, from a court about what is legitimate and what's not. And that's because religion in this country is always in transition, but also because there are so many different religious groups with different ideas about the state and about how their own religious visions and behaviors should or should not interact with the state, that we're going to continue to have this process of the church and state boundary continue to play out over time. So our reading for Thursday in our discussion is a kind of what if question. I gave you a short article about religion in the military and asked you to think about how we should decide an issue like that. And so keep in mind particularly these two approaches, these either separationist or accommodationist approaches, and how they tap into different arguments in the First Amendment. Keep that in mind as you think about the ways that we in the United States should try and navigate an issue like this. Okay, that's it for now. In our next lecture, I'll probably give a short lecture where I kind of wrap up some of your comments from this week before we move into a new week next week on civil religion. All right, thanks. Hope you're well. Bye-bye.